You're now tuned in to the Better Brain Podcast with your hosts, Miles Sorrell and Dr. Michael Lewis. Dive deep into the world of brain health, the latest in neurobiology, natural health, and nutrition. Stay up to date with groundbreaking research and discover the power of natural products and lifestyle choices. Stay curious and stay informed, because when it comes to your brain, knowledge is power.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Better Brain Podcast, sponsored by Natural Stacks Dietary Supplements. Here at the Better Brain Podcast, we discuss the latest topics in neurobiology with a specific eye for natural products research and various interventions such as lifestyle and diet that can augment cognitive health. So, my name is Miles. I'm a doctoral fellow at the University of Padua, and I'm joined by Dr. Lewis.
Yeah. Hey, Miles. It's always good to reconnect with you. We've done some great work, I think, in the past together, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm Dr. Michael Lewis. I am a classically trained physician, allopathic physician, an MD with an MPH, an MBA, and a bunch of other things. My really short story is I graduated from West Point, played Army for a few years, and then decided to go to medical school at Tulane University down in New Orleans, and continued on with my Army time and training through Johns Hopkins, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And at some point down the line, I was a professor at the medical school in Bethesda, the military medical school, and hit upon the idea of why aren't we using nutrition to help our soldiers recover from traumatic brain injury? And went and asked somebody, and I said, is anybody looking at it? They said, no, why don't you? And I was like, because I don't know anything about it. And he goes, yeah, but you're the only one asking the question. That was 15 years ago. So I've been on that quest ever since.
Awesome. And I'm really excited to be doing this podcast with you. If you search on Google or YouTube, traumatic brain injury and Omega-3's, there are numerous podcasts where you're the guest, but now you're a co-host with me as we start episode 1 of the Better Brain Podcast. So thank you for this collaboration. And what a fun way to kick off this new podcast by discussing traumatic brain injury and Omega-3. And so for our first-time listeners, I imagine that the way this podcast is going to work is we're going to discuss the latest topics in brain health in general. We have some breaking news that will start off the episode, and then we're going to discuss a scientific paper of high relevance and impact to structure the discussion for the rest of the episode. So I guess what's at the top of the order for breaking news? I guess Fiji was successful against Australia in rugby. Now, I'm not really a rugby person, but it's a rough and tumble sport and a lot of opportunities for athletic-related injuries. Tell me more about that.
Well, I will start off by saying that I'm on the board of directors of National Collegiate Rugby, and I'm the head of their medical and safety committee. So rugby is pretty near and dear to me. I played all 4 years at West Point. My senior year there, a long time ago, we were ranked number 1 in the country going into the national playoffs, which unfortunately we didn't win. And so rugby has been a part of my adult life, off and on for, my adult life. But what's the big news right now, the current news, is, of course, the World Rugby Cup 2023 being played in France, just up the road from you. And in fact, I think Italy played yesterday.
Against Uruguay, right?
Uruguay, yeah. They're 2-0, I believe, in their pool. They're in the toughest pool. I don't know if they're going to survive New Zealand and South Africa. No, I'm not sure. No, France, New Zealand and France in the same. So I don't know if Italy is going to make it through, but it'll be fun to watch. But yeah, rugby is a rough and tumble sport. Those boys from Fiji are just absolute monsters. I would not want to be. It's like stepping in front of a freight train, and Fiji beat Australia, I think, the first time in 70 years is yesterday. So, or not yesterday, but this weekend. And so it's lots of great rugby still to come. They're still in the pool rounds, and then we'll get to the quarterfinals in a couple weeks, and the finals being held the end of October in the Paris area at the National Stadium in Paris. But yeah, rugby is, a lot of people say it's like American football without the helmets. And yes and no. American football was probably derived from rugby. Rugby actually derived from soccer or football, as the rest of the world calls it. And obviously it's evolved from that, but you can only move the ball forward by running it or kicking it. You cannot throw it forward. And all 15 players on the team have a role every play. It's not like American football where the quarterback gets the ball and then whatever he does with it to the receivers or running backs or keep himself. You've got 10 other players or 9 other players that may not play any kind of a direct role. In rugby, everybody can get the ball. Everybody has to play defense and offense, and it is some hard hitting at the World Cup level. I mean, the best teams in the world will be in the semifinals, or and right now there's no clear favorite, so that'll be fun to watch.
And it sounds like a really fast-paced sport as well, given everyone's involvement on the team. Now, I wanted to ask you, of course, given the intensity of the sport without helmets, what is the rate of injury among players, especially head injury?
Certainly, if you look at the percentage of injuries, say, and it depends on at what level. Are you talking high school and youth? Are you talking college? Are you talking clubs? Are you talking professional level rugby? Or are you talking about national team, World Cup type of things? They're all a little bit different. Only the best of the best get to the top of the European leagues, typically European, but also Japan and New Zealand and Australia have pretty significant leagues, and South Africa. You get to the top of the leagues of they're professional teams, and that's where the national teams draw from those players. So when you at that level, first of all, they're just absolutely huge. The size of players, just like in American football, from 30, 40 years ago to now, has just weightlifting and nutrition and all kinds of things. The size of rugby players today is just absolutely monstrous. But that's also offset by the best teams, the best players have been playing most of their lives, and they're very good at technique. So you're not going to throw yourself headfirst into a tackle like they do in American football because you're not wearing a helmet. And so
they're a little bit
really
more cautious
about technique. I will say, because we were one of the, we were the number 1 ranked team my senior year in college. And we used to love playing the European teams that would come through because we'd learn from them, and it was just such a different, better, faster moving game. What we hated was playing like the upstate New York small college club teams, where it was a bunch of ex-football players drinking beer, and they had no idea how to tackle. They thought that you tackle like football, and that was the games where people would get hurt. Not the European teams where the technique is, something you grow up with. So the size of the players and the lack of helmet is really offset by the level of experience and technique.
Gotcha. However, I guess as someone that is not as sporty or is not, I personally don't play team sports as much as perhaps I would like to, but I keep imagining the concussions or the traumatic brain injury that the potential is there for among rugby players. I mean, perhaps we can just talk a little bit more about your experience with traumatic brain injury and healing it. I mean, speaking of breaking news, there was a new study that came out that had shown that among individuals with concussions earlier in life, that it could predispose for cognitive dysfunction later in life. So, you know, what is the fate of the upstate New York rugby player that drinks beer and gets their head hit?
There's a lot of debatable and controversial science about it, and particularly when it comes to the NFL and American football. A group out of Boston has a brain bank, and they're always talking about CTE and how 80% of the brains that they look at in postmortem have evidence of CTE. Well, there's a huge bias there, right? And that's an important numerator, but there's absolutely no denominator. How many NFL players have there ever been in the history of the NFL, and how many do we know died with or as a result of CTE? It would be a fraction of a percent. And so it makes for interesting news. Much better, bigger epidemiologic studies need to be done. But I always look at it, I kind of jump, and I have been accused of this way too many times, and it got me basically when I was at the Formed Services University Medical School, as I kind of jump over the problem and like, well, what are we going to do about it? And that's where my passion is. It's not in the diagnosis. I can look at somebody, I can see the tape, or I can be on the sideline of the field, or take a decent history and a quick exam, and you could tell if somebody's had a concussion or not. We don't need multi-million-dollar diagnostics per se. They help and they're good. They're just not to the point. I jump over that. I already got a 5-cent solution. Let's implement it. And that's what I've been kind of the bandwagon I've been beating for the last 15 years.
And of course, based on our previous discussions, I'm pretty familiar what you're alluding to. So Omega-3's, right? What are the nutritional solutions that we can use to support our brain under stressful clinical conditions? And I say stressful not as mental, emotional stress, but in actual physical stress, such as in the form of a traumatic brain injury.
Well, right. One of the things, here's how I describe it to patients: is you go outside to get the morning paper, if anybody does that anymore. Go out to the car and you slip on the ice, and your feet go flying, and you land right smack on your head, right, the back of your head, or kind of like a quarterback being tackled and falling backwards, right, and their head being slammed on the field or on the turf. So what happens? It gets into Newton's laws of physics, and body in motion stays in motion, and F equals ma, and all those good fun things, right? The brain's not a bowl of jelly. It's while the outside white matter cortex is gelatinous, underneath is really where a lot of the main functioning occurs in the old brain, or the brain stem and above. And those are much more complex, these dense organs within the brain, basically different parts of the brain. And so you hit your head when you fall on the ice, and your brain keeps moving inside your skull. You got that cerebral spinal fluid. It prevents minor little injuries, but not like a big fall when you hit your head on the ice. And so what happens is your brain keeps moving until it gets stopped and acted on by another force, right? And that deceleration is when the brain hits the inside of the skull. And so there can be reverberation. But if it's not a severe, or even by definition, a moderate TBI, traumatic brain injury, mild traumatic brain injury is 95% of all brain injuries are mild. We also call them concussions. There's not a difference between a mild TBI and a concussion. It's just a different name. And you don't, even if you go to the emergency room after having a concussion, if they do a CAT scan or CT scan, it's almost never going to show anything. The only reason why they're doing a CT scan is make sure you're not bleeding like actively in the brain. That is going to cause problems. But what happens is that impact, you're causing bruising, a contusion, and right, if you twist your knee, what happens? It swells up, right? You need that partly because blood vessels are being broken and stuff like that, but it swells up because you need inflammation. Inflammation is life. And, we hit your brain, you damage your brain, that microscopic that you won't even see on a CT scan, there's still inflammation that starts in these biochemical cascades. The problem is we're really, our dietary habits, our food supply, everything about that, if you talk in just terms of omegas, we are flush in omega-6s. And the downstream effect of omega-6s are to promote inflammation. And that's important, right? You need that repair to your knee when it swells up. But we need to, what do? We ice it, and, we try to get the swelling down, right? The edema, the inflammation. Well, the same thing with the brain, but we can't see it. So how do we get that microscopic neuroinflammation under control? And that's what omega-3s are for. They're meant to balance. You need the inflammation, then you need to be able to resolve it. And
right. I just want to stop you there for a moment, because I just really love what you said, that inflammation is life, because, you hear every day about all of these diseases related to the brain, the joints, et cetera, are inflammatory diseases. But it's the lack of resolution of inflammation that transitions a scrape into, a prolonged chronic degenerative disease that we don't have really good answers for unless you start to examine the nutrition science. So let's just orient ourselves around the chemistry for a moment, and then I'll let you keep talking. But no, just what really are these omegas? They're lipid mediators. They're lipids. And the reason why we're talking omega-3 or omega-6, they're polyunsaturated fats. That means they have double bonds along the carbon chain. And the omega-3 has the double bond starting at the third carbon from the end of the tail. And the reason why that's important is that whether it's an omega-6 or an omega-3, our body takes these lipids in our food supply. They get incorporated into our cell membranes, and then they get converted into almost neurotransmitter-like compounds, lipid mediators, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, muricins, resolvins, that all have different functions in the blood, in the immune system, in the cell. Endocannabinoids also being another metabolic biochemical fate of the ingestion of omegas. And as you pointed out, in the standard American diet, we have this abundance of omega-6 that includes arachidonic acid. And again, that gets shifted into these lipid mediators that then drive an inflammatory response, which isn't bad. It's just that we're saturated in our cells with all these omega-6s. So there's this constant on-inflammatory signal. We need the omega-3s to help to balance it in the other way. Do I have that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And so you're right. It's not about the inflammation. It's about the resolution of the inflammation. That's the key, but that's also the key we're missing, because the typical, like they call the standard American diet, is very heavy 25 to 1 type of ratio of omega-6s, the pro-inflammatory, to the resolving omega-3s. I mean, I've done studies of thousands of soldiers in the military, and I think we came up with it was either 22 or 25 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the blood, as being measured. And so it's no longer a fair fight. So that's one of the issues. We need to decrease the omega-6s in our diet, but that it's fat, right? How long is fat going to stay in your body? It's going to take months to years. Well, I've got somebody with a concussion, a head injury. I got to play on the other side of the coin, the omega-3 side. So how do we get these omega-3s up as quick as possible? And so I do what I call targeted nutritional therapy. And specifically, one of my original ideas was, how do we develop that, what I now call the Omega protocol. And so it's really about a loading dose. How do we get the Omega-3's up as quick as possible to start to counter the effects of the Omega-6s? I'll just throw in one quick story. I always look at Muhammad Ali, took a few punches to the head as a young man, and he ultimately died with Parkinson's disease. And seeing the last few decades of his life, it was kind of sad, because he was such an amazing boxer, such an amazing athlete. The question you got to ask yourself, is there a connection, right? And we're looking at that with CTE and football players. Is there a connection? Yes, there is. And I would argue that connection is inflammation that never fully got resolved.
Yeah.
I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but inflammation is definitely, to me, that chronic inflammation is huge. It's key.
Right. And I think what some people don't realize is that when we're talking about chronic inflammation, we're talking about this low-grade inflammation, this activation of the immune system, the secretion of inflammatory factors that is just constantly stressing out the cells, effectively shortening their replicative capacity, their ability to adapt to the environment. So, there's also various nutritional strategies that can help to lower inflammation, aside from omega-3s, that also involve strengthening the cellular's homeostasis capability, its homeostatic capability.
Well, that's what you're doing your PhD work on, right?
Right. That's a story for another episode, for sure. But the mechanisms behind brain inflammation are really quite complex. And, we would love to say, oh, it's this thing, take this pill and you're done. And of course, you've certainly had a lot of success treating your patients with omega-3s. But actually today I wanted to discuss this paper that I think really underpins how complex the story is. But I'm curious to hear if you think it has any clinical relevance outside of what I think is some really interesting biochemical and biochemical relevance. But so I'm talking about this paper, which we'll put in the show notes, that was published in the journal Cell, which is one of the most prestigious journals in all of biomedicine, I would argue. And so this was Queensland University in Brisbane, Australia. They had shown that microglia, which are one of the brain's resident immune cell types, actually promote the healing in following a traumatic brain injury in mice in a manner that is dependent on one of the cytokines that is inflammatory, IL-6. So, yes, go ahead.
Well, it makes sense, but just to give the listeners a little bit more background. So, the microglia are essentially like in a neutral state until they're acted upon by things like IL-6 and other mediators. And then they differentiate into one of two types, either the pro-inflammatory type or the anti-inflammatory type. And so, but they've got to be activated. And so it makes sense that an inflammatory mediator would activate them. The question is, which direction are they going when they're activated? Is the bigger question, but it makes sense, right? You don't need resolution of inflammation unless you have inflammation. So how's that being mediated? How's that being signaled?
Broadly, I also want to emphasize that in research, I feel as though there's certain dogmas whereby scientists try to frame, and we should all be unbiased, but, a lot of research is, of course, influenced by certain biases. It's in the name of certain proteins, or they name receptors after the toxicants that that are activating the receptors rather than their endogenous function, because they discovered the receptors via those said toxicants, for example. And I think that can in some ways drive some hidden biases in research. And so, one of the kind of popular conceptions that this paper actually debunks is that the microglia are only causing this sort of inflammatory state in the brain. I mean, the state of the science for many decades was that the brain is this immunologically privileged region in our body where the typical immune players don't sneak across the blood-brain barrier and don't really involve themselves with neurobiological processes. And we now know that that is not really true, but there is, a grain of truth in that kind of paradigm a little bit. And so for the longest time, microglia, which are cousins of peripheral macrophages, were thought to be the primary resident of the immune system in the brain. And you find activated microglia that seem to be correlated with worse outcomes in neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury. But what this paper had really elegantly done, and why it got published in Cell, is because the scientists really backwards and forwards use multiple genomic and pharmacological techniques to show that, in fact, the microglia have a positive role in protecting the brain, and actually not just protecting the brain cells, but actually triggering adult neurogenesis, new nerve cell formation in the hippocampus that has to do with memory. So what the scientists had done was they were able to remove microglia from mice that had been given a traumatic brain injury. And for some listeners, that might sound a little barbaric to give mice a traumatic brain injury, but this is science. And they found that removing the microglia neither exacerbated nor worsened the state of the traumatic brain injury. And indeed, that when they repopulated the microglia, that it had a significant effect in preventing the neurological and cognitive deficits in the mice caused by the traumatic brain injury. And then they found that it was because the microglia were responding to IL-6, which is the cytokine that, you may have heard, for some of our listeners,
well,
you may have heard.
It's very closely associated with inflammation.
Right.
So.
Right. You see IL-6 involved with the cytokine storms that everyone at the beginning of COVID was worried about in their lungs. IL-6 is associated with tissue damage in rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease, right? It's involved with a lot of these autoimmune diseases. It's considered a mediator, and there are drugs that target IL-6. But here, in this paper, the scientists actually injected IL-6 into the hippocampus of the mice that had a traumatic brain injury, and they grew new neurons. How do you, what's going on?
It's really complicated, and much of it we don't understand. Come on, it's the brain. We really don't understand what's going on. And when we try to this is one of the issues that a lot of people have with the scientific method over, say, the last 100 years, and particularly when we start to talk about nutritional science. We all want to get down to this minimal single action, and you think about it in just clinical medicine, and it's like, you have this problem, you have problem A, I'm going to give you drug B and try to get rid of problem A. And, so we try to minimize things. And when we're talking about inflammation in the brain, it's pretty complicated, as you can imagine. And so it's not so simple to say IL-6 does X. IL-6 may start a chain of reactions that are become way complicated. When, we talk about omega-6s and omega-3s and the downstream effects, well, I started to look at, some of the, there's omega-9s, there's omega-5s, there are all kinds of things, but it's not just those. There's, when you get digging into the cannabinoid system, it gets really complicated. So you and I know, anandamide or, arachidonyl ethanolamide, right? Which is technical name. It's made from omega-6s. And then when it's broken down, it's broken, it's only around a very short time. It's our happy molecule, and it gets broken down back into arachidonic acid, which we were just talking about how arachidonic acid is inflammatory. So how do we have this great important molecule in our brains that gives us and causes happiness, much like oxytocin and I just blanked on one. But anyway, causes us happiness, and yet it's comes from and broken down into a pro-inflammatory molecule. Well, the good news is, omega-3s and all the other fatty acids, whether it's from coconut oil or whatever, they all have a similar thing. And so the one that's always interesting to look at is what's the analogous omega-3, and that's nickname. It's got the docosahexaenoethanolamide, if I even said that correctly. And the reason we got those, so we give them nicknames, and that one's been nicknamed synaptamide,
right,
because it helps grow more and more synapses, particularly in the hippocampus.
right.
So is IL-6, bringing this back around, is IL-6 promoting the macrophages to turning on the macrophages to go in and create neurogenesis? It's probably really complicated, but it's probably has something to do with the DHA we consume, and which subsequently gets made into synaptamide to grow new synapses, new connections.
I have a big smile on my face because, this is a really interesting topic, of course. For some of our listeners that might not be familiar, the endocannabinoid system is this kind of arm of the greater lipid signaling system in our body that's comprised of the cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors. These are receptors that are found all over the body, not just in the brain. And they mediate a number of really important signals in the body. And as you pointed out, the first endocannabinoid that was discovered in 1991, arachidinyl ethanolamine, was nicknamed anandamide because it binds to the same receptor that THC from cannabis binds to. So ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss. And if you switch out the omega-6 arachidonic acid that comprises the major portion, the lipid moiety of anandamide, with the omega-3 DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, you get synaptamide. So this is kind of another arm of the greater endocannabinoidome. And I think it's a really cool concept that perhaps that transient IL-6 expression in following a traumatic brain injury, maybe it does activate the conversion of DHA into synaptamide if the DHA is there. This sounds like a proposal for a research study. We need to ask Keon Kim or someone
if
to
the
study
DHA
this.
is there. I mean,
the
there's going
DHA
to
is
always
there.
be DHA there. The question is it just being overwhelmed by the arachidonic acid, the omega-6? It's going to be there. So we talk about maybe sometimes an omega-3 deficiency, which is a very fuzzy kind of thing. It's really just when you're just below a level where it's really about that parity, right? So it always comes down to balance. Well, omega-6 and omega-3 need to be balanced. We need inflammation. We need to resolve the inflammation. It's, you can go on and on and on about how many things. If we're, and we talk about this in general health terms, I'm, feeling balanced as an example, or out of balance. So it's really always comes down to the balance. And, whether you're talking macrophages, omegas, endocannabinoid system, or whatever, it's all about balance.
Right. It's about providing our cells with the nutrients that are required to establish that balance, that homeostasis. Right. So then that begs the question, okay, let's say, God forbid I hit my head, how much omega-3 should I be taking?
Probably more than you're currently taking. So when I designed the Omega protocol, and this is not medical advice, just make sure that you realize that,
talk to your doctor.
Talk to your doctor and all the disclosures. It's not, so I'm not giving medical advice, but what I'm saying is you need to be, I look at it as a loading dose. And so there's nothing magical about the number that it came up with. It wasn't through any kind of scientific, processes, whatever. It literally got down to how many fish oil capsules do I think somebody would be willing to swallow in a day? And so the number that I hit upon was 3 capsules 3 times a day, or 9 capsules a day for at least the first week, if not longer. But then we get into quality of fish oil, right? And when I say 3 capsules, I mean 3 capsules that will have 1,250 milligrams size. But of those 1,250 milligrams, those two important omega-3s, EPA and DHA for their initials, there's 1,000 milligrams per capsule. So I'm talking about 9 grams of the really 2 important omega-3s.
Not the carriers, the active eicosapentaenoic acid, docosahexaenoic acid, EPA, DHA.
9 grams a day for a loading dose for at least a week, if not a little bit longer, depending on how long this has been going on. It'd be great if we could measure omega-3 and 6 levels on people before we started. We could narrow that in, but that testing is out there. It's very easily done. It just takes time.
It's not standard practice in
it's not standard
hospitals.
practice.
Yeah.
Plus, I know everybody's deficient anyway, and it's not going to hurt you. Even if I've had so many people like, I take fish oil daily anyway. I'm like, yeah, but not like this.
Yeah.
And they do, and they're like, wow, I didn't know I could feel so much more energy and think so much more clear. And it can really, if it's going to raise the curtain on that brain fog, it'll do it within 2 or 3 days easily. Wow. Sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, but not everybody. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is a nutritional supplement, right? Not I use it as a targeted therapy, but ultimately it's fish oil. Could you get the same effect from eating a lot of salmon? Yes, you should, theoretically, maybe even a better effect. But how many people are going to be eating salmon 3-4 times a day? It's just not going to happen.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind is, of course, it can be a little bit expensive to eat all that salmon, but also if you're eating salmon, then you're not eating corn-fed beef, for example, that has higher omega-6 levels. So, in addition to consuming more omega-3s, you're also excluding from your diet sources of food that may contain more degenerative ingredients. Now, I'm also reminded of the fact that in salmon, the pink color, just to change the topic for a moment, the astaxanthin is the reason why flamingos are pink. It's in krill. It's a really potent antioxidant. And
it is.
Yeah, studies show.
I think fish oil, supplements should have astaxanthin in it, and very few, if any, do. But to me, if I were making my own brand, I'd have that 1,000 milligrams of each, 600 EPA, 400 DHA. I might even do 500, but I'd add astaxanthin, honestly.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, studies show that it can help protect the skin from UV radiation from the sun. Studies show that it induces autophagy, which is kind of like our cellular vacuum cleaner that helps to remove damaged proteins and DNA that accumulate under this low-grade inflammation, right? So if we're thinking of the biochemical mechanisms that can support the brain and other parts of the body when we have low-grade inflammation, it sounds like astaxanthin is a perfect pair for the omegas.
You often find it in krill oil supplements.
Yeah.
Not so much in fish oil supplements. And krill oil and triglyceride form fish oil are absorbed at about the same rate. So when they say krill oil is better absorbed, they really mean better than the processed version that we see also in the pharmaceuticals called a ethyl ester, which is not an oil at all. And so we don't absorb things that oil is very easily absorbed, where ethyl esters, we don't have the enzymes, digestive enzymes to deal with that. Right. But anyway, back to krill oil. Krill oil, you pretty typically see astaxanthin as part of krill oil, which is one of its major benefits.
Right. Are there any other nutritional interventions that you would consider for someone that is looking for support for their brain. I guess I could throw out an ingredient that just popped into my mind is like a really high quality magnesium supplement.
Right. And magnesium,
magnesium L3 and 8.
Magnesium L3 and 8, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say glycinate, but it's 3 and 8 version is known to be better absorbed by the brain. And so, yeah, the quality of magnesium can also make a difference. Some magnesium is better than none, for sure. Interestingly enough, I got to know a few years ago a neurologist in the Washington, D.C. area, and we were talking about migraine, concussions and migraines and stuff like that. And it was interesting because I think he's from Argentina, so he's a little less Americanized, not born and raised here, but came here for training and never left. And so he thinks a little bit differently than a typical American doctor. And so we were talking about migraines, and he goes, well, I kind of put an IV in and hit a patient with substantial doses of magnesium IV, and headaches almost 100% go away pretty quickly. Because the question is, how long do they stay away?
Sure.
Some people it's 24 hours. Some people they never get another headache the rest of their life, or it's a couple of months, and then kind of have them come into the clinic and hit them again, and get in a routine. And I asked, what about supplements that you would take orally? And he goes, just doesn't have the same effect, partly because we can't take enough magnesium orally to be the same as an IV.
Yeah.
But again, it also gets down to the 3 and 8 is the best absorbed version of magnesium.
I personally take a supplement of magnesium that contains the 3 and 8 taurate and glycinate forms in it, and for me that works pretty well. But I mean, what you're saying about the IV kind of reminds me of some of the stories from some of our naturopath friends who would inject themselves with glutathione before their exam or something like that to get a mental edge. But no, I mean, there's a lot of information to unpack here. I mean, we're going to have a whole additional episode on magnesium.
We're going to have to do a podcast series to cover how many good things that are good for the brain in the supplement world. I mean, throughout there's 100 or more. I mean, everything from N-acetylcysteine to glutathione to vitamin B6, vitamin B12, I mean, vitamin C, vitamin D, I mean, on and on and on and on.
Never mind the herbals, never mind the botanical ingredients.
Yeah, the bacobas and the ashwagandhas, and literally we've got, as I say, this is not a class. You can't do it all in one class. This would be not even a semester course. This is sort of a PhD amount of information when it comes to supplements in the brain.
I think this is the perfect place to kind of wind down our conversation for today. This it's kind of a nice point at which we can allude to what comes next, future episodes of the Better Brain podcast. So everyone that's listening, thank you so much for your attention today. Dr. Lewis, always a pleasure. And thanks so much for Natural Stacks for sponsoring the Better Brain podcast. And until next time.